Hi, my name is John. This is my BFS Ben talk. The question was what discovery we'd had at our time at Penn, and my thesis actually sort of goes through this notion that there's no such thing as a discovery. So I'm just going to launch right in and talk about that. So philosophy, said Wittgenstein, leaves everything as it is. Now it wasn't particularly clear whether Wittgenstein was complaining about philosophy's incapacity to speak to the actual stuff of people's lives, its refusal to do so, or whether he was actually issuing a recommendation that philosophy done right actually leaves everything as it is, in the sense that every time somebody had tried to impose an abstract philosophy on the world, like abstract Marxism, for example, in the sense of Leninism or Maoism, things had gone wrong for the world, and therefore that the fact of philosophy was actually to philosophize and not to engage with the world. That as it is, every time a philosophy comes about that actually attempts to tackle the sort of real issues we face in the world, people, mostly so philosophers, get really excited. And this is my attempt to look at two of these philosophies. That was my thesis, looked at these two philosophies in an attempt to sort of understand how they went about this business. The first one is utilitarianism, and typified by this movement called effective altruism, and the second one is pragmatism, American pragmatism. Now, for the sake of this Ben talk, I will only focus on effective altruism because of the purposes of time. But if you would like to listen more about the American pragmatism part of it, I'm willing to talk to anyone. So, in the method of ethics, Henry Sedgwick, the Victorian philosopher, sought to provide what he termed a correct framework of obtaining reasoned convictions about what ought to be done. Pleasure, he thought, was the only thing that was intrinsically good, and therefore ethical conduct was objectively right when its principal consideration was the impartial maximization of pleasure for all those involved. But because we were all contaminated by allegiance of some sort and therefore could not be trusted to maximize or be impartial, the recourse for Sedgwick was to approach ethical action from the point of view of a neutral observer. A neutral in this sense for Sedgwick could not be anything. It had to be hypothetically truly reasonable, perfectly neutral, and objectively maximizing observer, or as close to this as we could get. And what this observer concluded was most important, was most impartial and maximizing. Sedgwick thought was what was objectively the true ought, what we were rationally and ethically compelled to adopt as a moral point of view. Sedgwick termed this the point of view of the universe. Now, in contrast to this, the pragmatists, most typified by William James and more so John Dewey, rejected any notion of an objective truth existing in the world, and therefore the notion of anything being discovered, because there was no such thing, no epistemology to ground this objective truth. Truth, the pragmatists thought, was a function of linguistic and cultural intersubjective agreement, and so was created by human beings, not discovered out in the world. When I said this is a tree, the pragmatists argued, what was true was that there was something there that typified a tree, but they thought that the notion, the idea of treeness that sort of came to our heads was a fact of linguistic agreement or intersubjective agreement between members of a certain community. For a bird, this is a place to have a house, for example. And so for the pragmatists to ask the Platonic question, what is this, was a useless question. Instead, they sought to ask the more practical question, what are the effects or the consequences of this, and what do we do about them? There was no objective teleology for the pragmatists. Rather, the function of language was to engender consensus. And meliorism, which is improvement out in the world, which is why I said this philosophy is try to engage with the world, only occurred when the broadest swaths of people affected by particular issues came together to tackle those issues. This, for pragmatists, mandated democratic experience. And so what is good for us then ended up being expanding the notion of what us were, so that we could democratically agree upon what this was. Now that's just a short synopsis on the pragmatists, but for the rest of this I'm going to concentrate on what I thought was wrong with the Sedgwickian point of view of the universe as sort of how we look at all of ethical actions. So, effective altruism is a utilitarian-led philosophy and movement that aims to use, quote, reason and evidence to do the most good. It takes Sedgwick's point of view of the universe as the objective point of determining moral obligation. Using something known as quality-adjusted life years, or QALYs as they call them, a popular measure in contemporary welfare and health economics, they make calculations regarding moral obligation, insisting on maximization and impartiality as metrics. By this view, we can objectively come to very precise value judgments about our moral obligations by finding precisely what maximizes. And so, for example, if we find out that donating to orphan children provides more curalis to us than donating to women suffering from complications arising from fistula, for example, then we have a moral obligation to donate to the children and not the women. To not do so, they contend, would be to be unfair to the children. It would be this view of beneficence arising from Sidgwick's epistemological view of the point of view of the universe that I outlined earlier, I argue has very pernicious practical consequences. For one, I think it creates moral imbeciles. The best effective altruist is one who is abstractly interested in doing good, but is too busy or not bothered enough to determine what good is for themselves. By this quality counting view, then, what is moral is the maximization of pleasure, and that is already known. What then happens after that is that we make utilitarian calculations regarding how to perfectly achieve this already known view of morality. This, I argue, leaves too much authority in the hands of people I'm calling moral experts. And so people like the leaders of the effective altruism, it falls on them to calculate and to tell us exactly what is moral, exactly how to lead our and quote-unquote ethical lives in a way that maximizes and is impartial. The result of this, I'm arguing, is the creation of many people who could perfectly be well comfortable in the sort of society we live in, but who await directions at every turn to be told how to best achieve their moral obligations. For example, effective altruism argues that donating to charity is working for a charity is much more ineffective than, for example, working in investment banking, in donating much of your income from there. And a lot of effective altruists then follow on to this, and I argue this creates moral imbeciles, very briefly. The second contention I have is a notion known as the demandingness objection, first outlined by the British philosopher Bernard Williams. And so there are two views to this thing I'm calling demandingness. Either, as the effective altruists would say, that they are pointing out to us by showing us what maximizes the actual extent of our moral obligations. So a very common example they like using is the case of a drowning child in a pond, and that we have an obligation to jump into the pond to drown that child, even if that messes up our clothes. And in the same way, they lift that analogy and argue that we have a similar obligation to save starving children in other parts of the world. And the connection they have to this is that by diving into the pond to save the child, we are recognizing that what matters is that the life of this child outweighs anything else that we possess. And because we recognize this about a life, it should be about any life. Now, when I talk about the demandingness objection, there are two ways to look at that situation. The first one, which the effective altruists claim, is that, well, this is just pointing to us the actual extent of obligations, that I actually have a moral responsibility to donate to those kids in China or India who are suffering. The other one, which is what I take, is to just argue that this, as Bernard Williams stated, presents an implausibly demanding view of morality, that it asks too much of me in such a sense that it ends up denying that I am me, that sometimes I care about things as they affect me more than as they affect other people. And so by the principle of maximization, we find that some things become eliminable. So for example, in the Iliad, Agamemnon, the Greek leader, intends to go to war to save his family's clears or honor. But for Agamemnon to do this, he learns that he has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. Now, most of us would want to say that this is a true sort of Agamemnon has two very conflicting moral claims made upon him. On the one hand, he loses all his family's honor, and that's the most important thing for a Greek, or he sacrifices his daughter. But by this principle of eliminability and maximization that the effective altruists sort of yield to, it would seem as if this is not a true competition of demands, as if there's no such thing as moral contingency that's playing out here. It would seem here that there's only one right thing to do, and that's what maximizes. And sort of this is the crux of Williams's critiques. Another example was artificial intelligence has been shown by the effective altruists to be one of the most important places to direct our resources by just how many qualities this would mean for humanity if extinction due to AI happened. Now, what this means is that when it comes to course selection, it does not matter that one's mother died from cancer or from malaria. All one should do is, as Cedric suggested, to look at everyone else as a container for utility, and then to distribute that utility in what maximizes. This, Williams and I thought, denied from the very outset the simple fact that I am me, that we are subjective beings, and that the reason why we care about things first and foremost is not because they maximize. So this, of course, could be one thing that we consider, but with regards to how those things affect us as individuals with continued beliefs, desires. So this objection from demandiness to arguing is a rejection of that Sedgwickian view of morality that attempts to ground morality in something objective, something existing outside of human experience. A view of morality that I think tyrannically dictates to us what we're obligated to do at very pernicious costs. Thank you.